Good morning, everybody. Thanks for that introduction, Alf. And everybody will know that I'm not Gianpaolo Merlini, and I'm not an expert in AL amyloidosis, but Myeloma UK have been working in the field of amyloidosis for 20 years, so I do know a little bit about it, and hopefully I know enough to give you a decent presentation. We only found out that Gianpaolo was not coming yesterday or the day before, so I'm very grateful to my colleagues at the Amyloidosis Research Consortium who are based in Boston, who helped me put some slides together for today, so I'm very grateful to them. So I recognise that for most people, the word amyloidosis, you may be hearing it for the first time at this conference. So amyloidosis is a group of diseases that comes about as a consequence of misfolded proteins that are otherwise called amyloid deposits, and they build up in the organs of the body. And I've got a few slides and a few images in later slides that shows you exactly what that means. So already you can think about this in the context of myeloma, because myeloma is exactly the same. Myeloma occurs because of misfolded proteins. Much like myeloma, amyloidosis is very difficult to diagnose because it's very rare, and the symptoms are very common of many other issues. In the US, there's around 3,500 new diagnoses per year, and that compares to about 40,000 myeloma patients, so it's about a tenth of the size of myeloma. And what's relevant for us as MPE is about 10 to 15% of myeloma patients will develop AL amyloidosis at some point. So at any one time, 10 to 15% of myeloma patients also have AL amyloidosis. And as I've said, not unlike myeloma, the symptoms are vague and can often be put down to a multitude of other issues, including just a very busy lifestyle and getting old. There's no single diagnostic blood test, and many of us get routine blood tests as we get older, so that's not going to be sufficient to diagnose amyloidosis. And there's no imaging, either X-rays or MRI, that will point to a correct diagnosis. And even when you may get the right diagnostic test, i.e. a tissue biopsy, it is still difficult to diagnose. Unfortunately, with amyloidosis, all types of it are fatal, so there's no cures for amyloidosis. And unlike in myeloma, where we've seen 13 new treatments approved by the FDA in the last 10 years, there are currently no FDA-approved treatments specifically for amyloidosis, but what I'll go on to show is that many of the treatments that have been successful in myeloma are also successful in AL amyloidosis. So this is a slide about the distribution of types, and you can see here that the most common one is AL amyloidosis, and this is the one that's most similar to myeloma. So just over 70% of people with amyloidosis will have AL type. All the rest are very rare. However, this one here, we think, goes undiagnosed the most. So if we had appropriate diagnostic tests, and say people with MGUS were being screened regularly for amyloidosis, we would probably see an increase in this one and all these ones, and a decrease in this one. This one normally gets diagnosed as a consequence of testing for myeloma. So as I've said, AL amyloidosis is the most common type. So this is where I think the talk can get more aligned to myeloma. It's described as being a clonal plasma cell disease, which is exactly the same as we would describe myeloma. And similarly in myeloma, where the paraprotein is the vector of disease, the misfolded free light chains, or the amyloid fibrils, is the vector of disease in AL amyloidosis. So unlike in myeloma, the paraprotein just circulates in the blood. In amyloidosis, the amyloid fibrils get deposited in the soft tissues and organs of the body. So it's a bit like if you think about your house, and you've got your kitchen sink, and you put rubbish down the plug hole, it doesn't move away, it stays in the pipes. So it's very similar in amyloidosis, is the amyloid fibril gets deposited in the organs and causes severe organ dysfunction. And then about 30% of patients will have more than 2 organs damaged. And the organs that are most often implicated are the heart and renal. And both of these organs are critically important to us surviving. And particularly in the heart, it can lead to restrictive cardiomyopathy, thickness of cardiac walls, and I think that having amyloid in the heart is one of the poorest prognostic factors, and therefore is a priority for treatment. So I really like this slide because I think we'll all recognize this slide from our myeloma world. So here you have monoclonal plasma cells, exactly the same as in myeloma. And in healthy people, there's around 3 or 4% of all the cells in our bone marrow are plasma cells, and their function is to produce proteins or proteins or antibodies that are used to go off and fight infection. So this is just a cartoon of what a paraprotein or a protein looks like. And here you can see the light chains, and just the same as in myeloma, there's an excess of light chains that are often produced, except in amyloidosis what happens is these light chains can go off and be deposited in the organs of the body, or they can join together causing amyloid fibrils and go off and get deposited into the organs of the body, causing organ dysfunction and tissue damage. So, I'm not an expert on Congo red staining, but what happens in amyloidosis in the context of diagnosis is that you take, or the doctor will take a tissue sample of the organ involved, and they use a technique or several techniques to stain that tissue. And upon staining of that tissue, the dye, as it were, binds to the amyloid fibrils that are present in the tissue sample and shows up the presence of amyloidosis. So there are 2 different techniques here, using a red dye and a green dye, and you can see where the red is. This is all amyloid deposition in the organs. And here, where you can see the green stuff, that's evidence of amyloid deposition in the organs of the body. This is another method, electron micrograph, and I'm even less of an expert in this technique, but this should all be white, and you can see all these little grey and black bits. That's evidence of quite significant amyloid deposition in the organ. In addition to tissue biopsies, if they're not conclusive, you can also do abdominal fat pad aspirates, which is basically taking a biopsy from fat, because amyloid also, because that's soft tissue, it gets deposited in the fat. And again, this is actually quite a good picture, because there's a very famous doctor in London that spent his whole career in amyloidosis, and he described the texture of the deposition as being a bit like when you fry an egg and you over fry it and it comes congealed and sticks to the frying pan, and it's quite hard to come off unless you use kind of boiling water and tons of free liquid. And that's what this shows. That shows this really congealed, really sticky, horrible deposition in an organ, which is quite hard to get out. You can't just flush it with water. You have to put in detergent, in theory, to get that out. So that's what's being deposited in the organs of the body. This slide doesn't really add much to what I've said. There's just some additional images of deposition in organs and shown up using the Congo red, the green, and I've forgotten the name of the other test. And all these diagnostic tests are fairly reliable and quite conclusive of a diagnosis. So in terms of survivorship, I mean, we're all accustomed to understanding that survival in myeloma historically was poor, but over the last decade has improved dramatically. And I would say the same has been true in amyloidosis, but to a lesser extent. So what you can see here is in a study from the Mayo Clinic of nearly 2,000 patients, you can see here that since the mid-60s and 70s to the mid-90s and the zeros, that 5-year survival has more than doubled from 11% to 28%, which is quite amazing for such a really tough and difficult disease with no licensed treatments. So that's improved, and I'll go on to explain a little bit about why that has improved, because I think that amyloidosis has benefited from the developments that are being made in myeloma, but not to the same extent. But really worryingly, and you can see here, is the 6 to 12 month prognosis hasn't changed at all since the 60s. So that's indicative of, I think, the consequences of a late diagnosis, where patients are diagnosed and they're so unwell and their organ function is so poor that they're not going to respond to any treatment. So the early death rate is very high. So much like in myeloma, if we can attribute appropriate amounts of time and investment into early diagnosis, it will concur without a shadow of a doubt in improved survival. I mentioned earlier on that if you've got cardiac involvement, then that is a negative prognostic factor. So people will survive less long if they have cardiac involvement. And this graph shows the different stages of cardiac involvement, where not much cardiac involvement to lots of cardiac involvement. So if you don't have that much involvement, you're going to live longer. If you've got lots of deposition, you're going to live less long. So this is a priority in research in AL amyloidosis, is how do we help patients with cardiac myeloma? And there's 2 treatment strategies in AL amyloidosis. So in myeloma, the therapeutic benefit of treatment is not targeted at the paraprotein, it's targeted at the plasma cell in the bone marrow that produces the paraprotein. When myeloma treatments are used in AL amyloidosis, it's the same. They target the plasma cell in the bone marrow that's producing the abnormal protein. We have no treatments yet that are aimed at destroying or flushing out the deposition that exists in the organs. So if we're really going to make a difference in cardiac myeloma, plan A, stop the production, so we can use a whole bunch of myeloma treatments to stop the plasma cells producing immunoglobulin. But we need new treatments to help flush out the deposition that exists in organs. So here are the treatments that are typically used in AL amyloidosis, and they'll all look very, very familiar because they're exactly the same as the ones that we use in myeloma. There are obviously access issues in myeloma, and similarly there's access issues in AL amyloidosis. In the UK, for example, there is strong support for access to treatments in cancer, but AL amyloidosis is not defined and characterized as being malignant. So it doesn't benefit from cancer policy in the UK, but given its similarities to myeloma, many doctors just describe it as being myeloma, and that improves access to myeloma treatments. And you can see right down at the bottom here is that we're beginning to think about, as we are in myeloma, new types of treatment, and particularly this treatment here, NEOD-001, and this one is very different to these ones because this one's aimed specifically at trying to dissolve and flush out and bind to the fibrils that are deposited in organs and get them out of that organ and excreted from the body. So there's a really good scan. I think it's only available in London. There's not that many places have this type of scan, but what this shows, So what this shows is all these black areas are pretty reflective of deposition of amyloidosis in the body, either in organs or soft tissue. Following a stem cell transplant, you can see that there has been quite a vast reduction in the deposition. And although the transplant itself is not involved in removing the deposition, because of the high-dose malphilan, it's very good at wiping out the bad plasma cells, and just through normal body functions, some of this deposition can be moved, but we're not laying down new stuff because the plasma cells have been destroyed by high-dose melphalan. So, Dr. Gardier, and he obviously gave two superb presentations this morning, talked a little bit about response to treatment, particularly MRD, and it's the same idea in amyloidosis. You measure response to treatment in a similar way in myeloma, where you're looking at the hematology, so you're looking at what's happening in the bone marrow. So much like in myeloma, if you have a very good hematological response, then the chances of getting a complete remission are higher. If you don't get such a good response and there's still presence of plasma cells, abnormal plasma cells in the bone marrow, then you may not have such a good response. Here is a graph, if that's what you call that, a graph of organ response. So following treatment, if organ response does not improve dramatically, then as a consequence, then prognosis may not be as good. So in AL amyloidosis, you're looking for a good hematological response in terms of the bone marrow, and you're looking for the deposition to be improved in the organs, so you get better organ function. These two things together are good for prognosis, but if you don't get good organ function recovery, then you're still in a bit of trouble, unfortunately. So the slide before here was talking about the current treatments, very similar to myeloma, and this is an example of new ways to think about how we can treat the deposition in the organs of amyloidosis. And here's just a range of treatments that are in early phase development currently around the world in various groups and with various kind of companies. And as you can see here, they all, through a variety of mechanisms, will bind to the fibrils that are deposited in the organs. So this is very cool stuff. And I think there's as much excitement in this area in AL as there is in the immunotherapy drugs that Dr. Gardier described earlier on today. But I also think in the context of managing expectations, this is difficult science and there's no guarantees that all this is going to work. But I think what's great here is we've got a pipeline of really exciting drugs, and we're getting data all of the time suggesting there's lots to be positive about. And ultimately, you can imagine a treatment approach in AL that would involve, for example, cyclophosphamide, bortezomib, and dex with one of these drugs. So that combination combined will take care of the plasma cell and also the deposition. So fingers crossed. So this is just a more in-depth look at one of these drugs, NEOD001, and this is just some data from a phase 1 and phase 2 study. And again, I'm not an expert in anything, as you'll all know. I'm certainly not an expert in reading data from studies, but I think the most important thing here is, I said earlier on that cardiac and renal, the heart and the kidney were the two organs that were most commonly implicated in amyloidosis, and certainly cardiac involvement is a negative prognostic factor, and therefore these treatments aimed at these two organs are a priority. And you can see here in 36 patients who received this drug, 19 responded, and I think what that means is that the deposition in the organs got better, and in 17 patients it didn't get any worse, it was stable. So very, very positive. And similarly in renal patients, there's a very similar number of responders. So this is super, super encouraging and super positive, and there's lots of excitement in the community about this drug, actually, particularly, and other drugs that are similar, and the extent to which they could potentially improve organ function by getting rid of that deposition in the organs. So this is all good stuff. So in summary, so I think the most important thing to say is that there I think, significant similarities between AL amyloidosis and myeloma, to the extent that we should think about including AL amyloidosis in our work. I mean, we certainly have done that for the past 20 years in the UK. Like myeloma, there has been good improvements in survival, and we don't have much quality of life data actually, but I would argue that quality of life has improved, but survival in AL is still not as good as in myeloma. And I think partly that's because of some biology, the characteristics of the disease, but I think it's mostly down to the fact we don't have drugs yet that can get rid of that deposition in the organ. So the gains that we've made in myeloma are not yet being translated to the extent that we would like in amyloidosis, and that's something we can all work on. And I really would emphasize the point that 10 to 15% of our patients will have AL amyloidosis. And I don't really have any stats on this, so this is just my opinion. I would suspect that as survival in myeloma continues to improve and patients will live with it as a chronic condition for 10 or 15 or 20 years, then it may be that the propensity to get AL amyloidosis might increase over time because patients are living longer, in the same way that the likelihood of getting secondary cancers or Alzheimer's might increase if you live longer. That may well be the case. So this could be a bigger problem for us in the future. That's just my hypothesis. I have no data on that. And I think that dealing with organ failure is an absolute priority, and as a consequence of that, the new drugs under investigation are showing huge promise in that area. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully I didn't embarrass myself. And if there's any questions,